They thought being in a hospital bed made me helpless. They were wrong. I was 32, half sedentary and half strapped into a neck brace that didn't forgive sudden turns. The air in my room tasted like disinfectant and fried coffee. The heart monitors beep a metronome for pain. My ribs felt like a stack of thin boards someone kept nudging. I could lift my hand. That was about it. I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't leave the building. I could, however, see everything that moved on the little tablet by my elbow. The call came from Jordan at 10:12 p.m. Her face filled the screen, all angles and lipstick, and behind her was my kitchen, black like a photograph taken through coal. She held something up like a trophy, my dog's leather collar, singed at the edges, the silver name tag still there, half melted. "Look what happened," she said, smiling the way you show off a souvenir. The view swung past soot-stained cabinets, the sink half melted, smoke still ghosting the tiles. Her voice was light. The camera went dead. That single frame, Jordan in a smoke-hazed doorway, my dog's collar in her hand, was a punch to the stomach that my broken ribs answered to. Barnaby was not in the frame. Barnaby was blind, small, stubborn in the best ways. He liked warm corners and the squeak of tennis balls. I immediately thought of him curled up under the crate by the back door where he always slept. My throat closed. The tablet blinked, then showed the message every parent of modern grief knows. Camera offline, live feed unavailable. But the app also had a note I hadn't thought about in a while. Cloud buffer active, last 20 minutes cached. That detail, almost bureaucratic, almost cruel, was the only reason I could see anything at all. Battery 18%, hospital Wi-Fi, shaky, my oxygen was optional, my will was not. I thumbed the download button with a finger that shook, not from pain, but because there is a particular kind of rage that shakes your hands. The progress bar crawled, 24%, 37, 52. The heart monitor's steady beep was suddenly a drumbeat counting down a real-time theft. On the preview frame, Jax, my sister's boy, 5 if I had to guess, stood too close to a pile of old wood and cardboard someone had brought in from a weekend project. Jordan was crouched beside him, phone in hand, coaching. I could hear her because the video had audio, the way cloud captures audio even when a live stream goes off. "Do it, Jax, do it, make it loud," she said. "Hurry, it's going to look cool on TikTok." Jax, in a plastic raincoat festooned with cartoon cars, held a red marine flare in both hands like a rocket. He looked ecstatic and terrified at the same time. You could see the flare spit orange sparks. Because of the camera angle, you could also see where Barnaby had managed to wedge himself, half under a wooden crate, half under the warmth of a patch of sunlight. He didn't move when the flare spit. The wood caught. Flames licked. Jordan turned, checked the camera, tucked her phone into a sling and walked out with Jax trailing, her purse swinging, and the last decent image was the collar held up like a prop. By then, my progress bar was at 98%. 99, 100, save complete, file name, evidence, boxon, MPP4. The way the letters looked in the corner of my tablet felt like punctuation. There was no relief, only a new programmatic clarity, timestamp, metadata, uploader IP address, camera serial. I wasn't there, but the truth was, I don't want to linger on Barnaby's death. That cathedral still exists every time I close my eyes. He wasn't a clause or a line item. He was a soft thing that lived in my apartment and trusted me. I was supposed to keep him safe. He died because someone thought a moment of internet fame was worth the risk. That knowledge settled in my bones like a verdict. When I called my mother, she answered as if a kettle was boiling in the background. "Athena, he's okay," she started, and then, when the sound of something clattering in the background made it impossible to imagine calm, she switched tactics. "It was an accident," she said, like a script she had been carrying for years. "Just say electrical short. Say it was the wiring. Don't make a thing of it. There is going to be a cruise deposit at stake, $28,000. You always have to use such big words." I read her message again, word for word. I read Jordan's voicemail. "It looked fake on camera, but it wasn't my fault, Mom." And I felt two things at once. A wave of grief and an old, familiar tightening in the gut that had nothing to do with my injuries. For years I had been paying bills to keep a life afloat that wasn't mine. $5,800 every month, coming out like clockwork. For years my ledger was a drumbeat of transfers and autopay. The sum had stacked into something obscene. roughly $696,000. I had sacrificed apartments, hours of overtime, nights alone, the kinds of minor humiliations that money smooths over for other people. There is a particular cruelty in watching the people you help treat your largesse as a right. Susan, the woman who raised me, had the audacity to treat my forensic attention as an administrative annoyance. Handle the paperwork. As if grief could be folded into an insurance form and placed in a manila folder. I stared at the file name again. Evidence Nux Son, Dem PP4. The name smelled like salt and algebra. My profession, auditor, forensic analyst, somebody who converts paper into truth, wasn't a side skill. It was the reason I could do anything at all. I had administrative access to that homeowner's insurance portal because someone had left me as a secondary contact years ago, and no one had ever bothered to change it. I could see claim IDs, policy numbers, and the history of backups for that camera. I could see the policy's terms and the notes left in the insurer's portal. I remember thinking, with the cynical precision my job rewards, that institutions are like machines. They respond to inputs predictably. If you feed them enough credible, properly formatted data, they will process it. They don't care about your muscle or your tears. They care about documents, timestamps, and properly attached evidence. I opened the insurer's portal, not as a hack, not as subterfuge, but as an authorized user checking a policy. The interface felt obscene with its corporate sleekness. There was a section for claims, a pull-down of reasons, an option labeled Material Breach Disclosure. The language there is clinical by design. It names when a policyholder's actions or inactions void coverage. I selected it, typed a short factual summary, names, date, time references, the fact that the video's metadata matched the camera on the property. I attached Evidence Son, DMPP4. The upload bar moved with the same incremental mercy as that first download. 25, 40, 76, 100. A confirmation popped up, a small triumphant ding. I kept my eyes on the screen even though every instinct told me to close the laptop and sob. Within minutes, because institutions triage risk, the portal popped a red banner in my view, policy suspended, pending review, intentional acts exclusion applied. The language was corporate and absolute. I took a screenshot. The red banner looked like a gauntlet thrown. The insurer's internal flags did what their algorithms do. They escalated this claim from accident to potential intentional act. It does not mean the insurer had found a guilty party. It meant their compliance engine had moved the file into a different workflow, one that required investigation and that crucially would stop automatic payouts for claims while that investigation ran. This is where the ledger met the law of collateral. Homeowner policies are not a standalone promise. They are a condition in the mortgage contract. Clause 14b of my mother's mortgage, the one I had read once when I tried to help them refinance and then filed mentally for later use, was a simple, brutal sentence. Failure to maintain hazard insurance constitutes default. The lender watches insurance status the way a parent watches bank balances. A suspended policy triggers lender risk protocols. I knew that because being an auditor is mostly knowing where the dominoes fall when someone pushes the first one. I sent the mortgage lender a formal notice, screenshot attached, policy suspension banner, brief cover note, not a threat, just facts. Professional, concise. The lender's side is trained to act when collateral is at risk. Within hours, my mother's account had a new flag and a notice that they were being escalated to the risk department with an option that could lead to acceleration of the mortgage. Acceleration is the financial mechanism that pulls future payments into the present. It's not a sword I wanted to gleefully watch fall, but it is immediate and institutional and therefore more irreversible than any phone call. On top of that, I reported the cards associated with Susan's account as compromised. I didn't invent fraud. I flagged them as stolen/lost using the cardholder's own portal access I still had because I had been managing autopay. Banks are calibrated to respond to fraud flags swiftly. Cards are frozen, transactions declined, fraud markers placed on accounts. The consequence is humiliating but clean. No more easy purchases, no more undisclosed transfers, no ability to use plastic as a cushion. When I hit send, a small cold thing settled inside that I can only describe as professional satisfaction. Not joy, not revenge. Satisfaction is not the right word. let's call it alignment. The outside world responded predictably. Systems processed inputs. Institutions by their nature do not answer to family ties, they answer to data. Then there was the airport. I hadn't planned for the airport scene. It was a staged consequence. They were trying to leave town for a cruise their lives were clearly predicated upon. I watched it happen through a dozen small, undramatic updates. A declined charge at the check-in desk, a boarding pass denied because the credit card used for upgrades had been flagged, a call over the loudspeaker. Jordan's voice on another video call went shrill. Susan's face was a practiced mask that began to crack. The airline agent asked for another form of payment. There was none. Handbags were opened. Receipts were fished out. A woman in a blue blazer, an agent who had done this job for longer than any of them had been adults, took Jordan's card, swiped it again, and the little machine flashed red. The agent's face didn't look up from the machine. There was no cruelty in her calm. There was only procedure. Then Gabriel appeared. Gabriel is a friend with a law firm's rhythm to him, efficient, in a suit that still suggested he belonged behind a courtroom table. He walked straight past the confusion and handed a sealed envelope to the airline's duty manager. In it, the insurer's formal denial, the lender's notice, and a copy of the police report motion requesting investigation for arson and child endangerment. I had not called the police in that moment. Other people had. But my upload had given the insurer something to act on. The insurer had, by policy, the obligation to escalate a potential intentional act to law enforcement for their own risk mitigation. I had created an evidentiary breadcrumb trail. That trail was now running into institutional processes that did not care about family pleading. There was a moment when Jordan realized the phone in her hand had recorded more than a selfie. She kept saying, "It wasn't me. I didn't mean," but words don't undo motion. An officer approached, then two, then more. Jordan's detainment wasn't cinematic, it was efficient. Handcuffs are not a moral arbiter, they are a mechanism. The charges listed later, felony arson and child endangerment, were what the responding unit put on their paperwork after reviewing the materials the insurer forwarded. I wasn't in the room when it happened. I was in the bed, hands clasped around the tablet, listening to the hum of machinery and the distant rush of what I had set in motion. Susan's facade cracked in other ways. Photographs of her stepping out of a rideshare with that singed collar in one hand and sunglasses on her face spread across a small circle of acquaintances. Friends who had always preferred the version of Susan who wore new things and kept secrets began to ask quiet questions. The house, my mother's house, was not immediately taken away. These procedures move in time frames that make sense only to institutions. But the flags were there. Insurer suspended, mortgage at risk, cards frozen. The lifestyle that had been propped up by other people's labor and my monthly transfers had nowhere to land cleanly. 3 months later, I moved into a small, sensible apartment 2 subway stops away from the hospital. It was quiet in a way that felt honest. I paid cash for the deposit because I had learned the value of liquidity in a way some people learn only after it's gone. My account, after reserves and necessary legal fees, held $24,000. Not extravagant. Not starvation. Enough. I kept Barnaby's urn on the little mantle I could carve out above the radiator. Next to it, the one tennis ball he actually liked, and a photo of him asleep under the sun patch by the back door. I cried sometimes. There are corners of grief that belong to the past and corners that require taxes and letters and insurance forms. I honored both. Mourning is not one shape. Susan sent me a handwritten letter that arrived like an artifact from another century. It was 1 page with larger loops than usual. She had tried to make it elegiac and also pecuniary, equal parts apology and plea. I read the first line and then the second. Then I fed the page to my office shredder, not out of cruelty, not out of triumph. Because the letter asked me for absolution and money at the same time, and I am not interested in being both somebody's confessor and their ATM. People ask me if I felt vindictive. The correct answer is complex. There were moments where my satisfaction was undeniably cold and clean, and I allowed myself that. But my guiding ethic, the one that had sustained me as an auditor, was never revenge. It was proportionality. Those systems were built to allocate risk and consequence. I used them exactly as they were intended to correct what had been damaged. I turned evidence into an institutional response, not into a personal vendetta. There are 3 parts of this story people latch onto and make into fairy tales. First, that being incapacitated is a permanent marker of helplessness. It's not. Being physically limited does not erase agency. Agency takes many forms. Sometimes it looks like a spreadsheet and a well-timed upload. Second, that punishment is satisfying. It can be, in small doses like medicine, but satisfaction is not the goal. The goal was containment. The goal was to ensure there were actual consequences when someone chooses a childish stunt over a living thing. Third, that this was easy. It wasn't. There were calls and texts and a lot of unpleasant conversations where I had to let family rage at me and call me ungrateful. "You always have to use such big words," Susan wrote in a text, the old belittlement that had been a motif of my life. I allowed the words to wash over me. I told myself the priority was truth. I repeated it like a tether. If you're listening because you want the nuts and bolts, be advised, this is not a how-to. I'm not here to teach you to weaponize administrative access. I'm here to tell you that institutions respond to properly formatted, credible inputs, that a red banner in an insurer's portal can do more than your anger, that mortgage contracts are more literal than family promises, that banks, when you report cards compromised, freeze transactions to stop the spending that keeps someone else's life afloat on your credit. These are descriptions, not instructions. I did not celebrate a single arrest. I did not post the mugshots. When Jordan took a plea deal months later, I learned about it through a sparse court notice I received via certified mail. It said, in the antiseptic prose the justice system favors, that she had accepted a plea to a reduced charge. Susan, for her part, lost the house. The mortgage acceleration procedures were not a dramatic eviction scene. They were a cascade of notices and one late notice that they simply couldn't counter with funds. Their lives contracted, mine steadied. People who have never been someone's financial safety net don't understand how much of identity is built around enabling others. I had been groomed into usefulness by a combination of guilt and expectation. There is a specific exhaustion to watching people you love weaponize your kindness as an entitlement. You pay the cable, you cover the utilities, you pay for the vet, you pay because you hope that love will be honest in return. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. There is a single line I keep in my head that I repeat like a defensive mantra. Peace is not an apology. It took me years to learn that peace can be bought with silence, but silence costs you your boundaries. The day I clicked upload, I decided I would not sell peace for the price of my dignity. A month after everything, when the rain was heavy enough to feel biblical and my apartment was lit by a single lamp and the urn caught the light in a way that looked like a small planet, I burned my notebooks. Not the ones with evidence or ledgers, those went to council, but the notebooks that had my shame written in them. Why I thought I had to do more, why I had been complicit in my own being used. I burned the pages like a ritual and then called an old friend who is a therapist and scheduled a meeting. Grief, I had learned, needed peers and paperwork in equal measure. This is not a morality play with a clear villain and a shining hero. There are people I love who have behaved inexcusable ways. There are systems that worked exactly as they should. There are consequences that landed where they fell. My role was never to ruin anyone out of spite. It was to stop the thing that was happening to me and to others. To make sure the next time someone thought a cheap stunt was worth a life, there would be a document trail that made that calculation matter. If you're sitting with someone in your life who treats your money and effort as entitlements, there are 2 practical, not legalistic lessons I want to share, because they shaped what I did and might shape what you decide to do. 1. Keep records. Not obsessively, not for paranoia's sake, but because truth is easier to prove when it's written. 2. Prioritize your financial independence. The monthly transfers I made were an armor I shed. That process was slow and painful, and it required me learning how to say no without telling a story. When the dust settled, I didn't feel like a victor. I felt like someone who had finally stopped being a walking ATM. I felt like someone who had made the smallest possible set of calculated legal moves to turn grief into accountability. I felt like someone who had learned where the dominoes fall and placed one deliberately so they could not be toppled again. There are people watching this who will feel anger, and people who will feel vindication, and people who will feel hollow. All of those reactions are valid. None require you to become someone you are not. If you are hurting, consider the tools you already have, documents, receipts, emails, and consider the power of institutional processes. They are not perfect, they are not fast, they are often cold, but they are impartial. Now, because I promised a soft ask earlier, if you want to see how this ends, how paperwork becomes more than paper, and how an audit can become a boundary, stick around. There is a quiet sort of justice that comes from proportionality, and this was mine. The last scene I remember before I close this chapter in my head is small and domestic. Rain on the window, a shredder that chewed up Susan's page like a small machine eating bad memories. Barnaby's tennis ball, still fluffy in one spot. My bank account standing at $24,000, sufficient, not ostentatious. And the knowledge finally that I am not anyone's automatic withdrawal. You don't owe being anyone's safety net. You owe yourself the right to survive. If this story landed with you, if you've been the family ledger or the fallback person, share it. Leave a comment about a time you learned to set a boundary or what holding on to autonomy has cost you. If you found something in this that helped you, subscribe for more stories where the small functional truths of systems meet the messy truths of family. I don't have a tidy sermon for you. I have a ledger, a funeral urn, a shredder, and the quiet that comes from finally closing an account that was never yours to begin with. They ruined the house while I lay in the ICU. I handled the paperwork, I kept the receipts, I kept the peace, I kept myself. Not a hero, just someone who learned the cost of generosity and stopped paying it alone.